Hello. We're starting our first panel today. The panel will be international, but with faces you know very well. First person on our panel will be Jason Pelmer. Jason, he is head of IFC in Ukraine, Moldova, and Belarus. Jason works with governance in Ukraine quite a bit. He is also head of nomination committee that nominates candidates for the supervisory boards of state-owned companies. Second, our participant is Garth Willis. Willis, he's an officer at USAID for democracy and governance. The first speaker is Sarah Sultan. Sarah is a policy analyst and project manager on corporate governance and corporate finance with OECD. Sarah knows Ukraine very well. She did quite a bit of work on governance in Ukraine, so she knows the country very well, and she will be able to compare what we have in Ukraine and other countries where she worked. And last speaker is Maxim Libanov. Maxim is the head of Capital Markets Division at National Securities and Exchange Commission. Welcome. I see only 3 speakers. I hope that we have also the 4th, but he is not on the screen. All right. It's difficult for us today, to avoid any technical problems because we're doing this format first time, and it is not straightforward as it seems. But hopefully next time we're better, because it seems that we will need to work in this format for quite some time, because COVID is much worse than we expected at the very beginning. Jason, I see that Garth is connecting, so very good. We have all of our participants. Jason, the first question is for you. It's a simple question, but the answer might not be that simple. And the question is, why do we need this corporate governance code that UCJ together with Securities and Exchange Commission prepared? What will it give for Ukraine? Why do we need it?
Thank you for that question, Adamos, and it's great to be with you, colleagues, albeit a virtual format. I think before I get to your question, also just to thank all the partners that are here today to have made this code possible, including yourselves, Adamos. The UCGA has been a leading platform in this space. But also working hand in hand with USAID and OECD and the Securities Commission. And also due to COVID, unfortunately, there was a hope to sign an agreement together with the Commission on promoting good corporate governance and green finance, but we'll have to leave that for another day. But getting to why this code, and I think that I think you're right, that the question is simpler than the answer. But I think it's important from multiple perspectives. First of all, corporate governance reform is critical for Ukraine, full stop, right? And so I think the code is one element in promoting good corporate governance, not only for listed companies, for which the code is mainly drafted for, but what we want to use the code for more broadly is promoting good corporate governance throughout the corporate world, be it a state-owned enterprise, be it a listed company, be it a smaller SME. I think there are lessons in here that are important for all corporate activity in Ukraine, and hence why we embarked on this task. But it's the listed companies and the joint stock companies that we hope show the leadership and use this code to improve their governance, not only for the sake of improving their governance structures, but to improve their business operations, to improve their efficiencies, to be able to attract capital and mitigate risks, mitigate commercial risk, mitigate environmental risk, social risk, and governance risks.
Thank you, Jason. You mentioned that the code is needed not for the sake of having this code, not for the sake of having a booklet with, which hopefully looks nice, but because it gives real value add for companies, because first of all, they become more transparent and maybe even more competitive. Can you tell us, when you evaluating businesses, can you use this code, and when I say you, and you're evaluating for lending transactions at IFC, can you use this code as a standard on governance, and those companies that comply possibly could receive better terms? Can this be used for this?
So Adamos, I mean, it's not a hypothetical. I mean, it's actually hardcore into the IFC DNA. Starting in 2018, we developed our own corporate governance standards, which have now been adopted widely. In fact, I think over the past 10 years, over $4.5 trillion of project finance across all emerging markets have been mobilized on the back of IFC performance standards and corporate governance standards. So this is already part of our due diligence and the way we evaluate companies. So the short answer to your question is yes. Corporate governance is a part of the due diligence process when evaluating companies. And IFC, I don't think, is unique in that regard. I think governance more broadly is important for all investors, be it equity investors, lenders, and we have empirical evidence that shows that companies with good corporate governance structures are able to attract better financing at longer terms.
Thank you, Jason. Sarah, you have a wealth of experience working in other countries as well as Ukraine on governance issues. I know that in Ukraine you work with Naftogaz. You also work with other companies, and you worked on the reform of state-owned companies in general. And I was wondering, can you, given your experience and ability to compare different countries, can you tell us what is the state of corporate governance? What is the level of corporate governance in Ukraine right now?
Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you so much, Adomas, for the invitation, and good afternoon to my fellow panelists as well. I think a big step forward is being taken today with the launch of this code. I would say that corporate governance is a nascent area in Ukraine, and the code can help build a common language for starters and establish a baseline for what can be expected for internationally accepted practices in corporate governance, such as the OECD principles, the G20 OECD principles for corporate governance, which were mentioned as one of the sort of inputs to your reflection process in developing the codes. Of course, where we've seen more active interest in the area of corporate governance reform has been in the area of state-owned enterprises. And I would say this is not an undue active interest. I think it's an area that merits a lot of focus. And I dare say that the OECD guidelines on corporate governance and state-owned enterprises have become more or less a household name now in Ukraine. And so it's nice to see this shift in focus to look at the broader corporate sector as well. Given that corporate governance reform, I mean, when we talk about corporate governance reforms, we're talking about introduction of boards of companies with independent directors, of instituting real systems of internal controls. We're talking about a real transparency and disclosure according to international standards. I mean, there's only a handful of SOEs that really meet the bar on those areas, but I'd say that it's an unusual, let's say, reform path that Ukraine has taken by starting with the state-owned enterprise sector as sort of the champion of corporate governance reform. But I think it's an interesting first step, and it's been fascinating work looking at some of the transformation that's happened in some big state-owned enterprise. And I would say that that transformation has been quite important in terms of raising awareness of these issues. Also, perhaps revealing some of the difficulties in really carrying out meaningful reforms. And it's always a bit trickier to start with state-owned enterprises because state-owned enterprises are by nature somehow mixed with political dynamics, and some of the major SOEs are also some of the major contributors, both in terms of dividends to the state coffers, but in terms of tax inputs into the tax system. So I would say it's an unusual way to have gone about it, and it's created maybe some discussion and debate around what are the benefits of corporate governance reform. But I think in the introductory presentations, there was some really good arguments for why good corporate governance matters. And we'll be looking at this more closely. This year, Ukraine has, with endorsement from the Prime Minister, agreed to embark on a national review against the guidelines for corporate governance of state-owned enterprises. So in the next year and a half, we'll be benchmarking Ukraine against this international standard. Perhaps in a few years, we'll be able to do this based on the OECD principles for corporate governance. While this focus on SOEs is important, I would say that I think, in order to create a level playing field as well, in Ukraine, there should be more focus on privately owned companies as well. And I'm glad to hear that the code is not just focused on the listed portion of the corporate sector in Ukraine, but also joint stock companies more broadly, because as we know, corporate governance are rather, the capital markets are rather underdeveloped in Ukraine. And I think part of the reason why corporate governance has been, because you asked me about the state of corporate governance in Ukraine, part of the reason why the state of corporate governance in Ukraine is rather nascent and let's say just sort of emerging is probably because of the fact that the capital markets are not fully developed, and stock exchanges are often developed or tasked with setting and implementing corporate governance standards. So in a way, it's a situation of the cart before the horse or the horse before the cart. But I suspect that there'll be a growing demand for this. And I think as Ukraine embarks on, a reflection process, deepening its capital markets, and as the demand for this becomes increasingly, let's say, more acute, access to capital is a major reason why, corporate governance matters. And this was mentioned earlier by Jason. And attracting foreign investment, even domestic investment, mobilizing domestic savings, and putting that to productive use, creating value for the Ukrainian economy. I think these are all key sort of rationales for pursuing this, even if it's still a very nascent area. I'll leave it at that for now.
Thank you. The key word what you said is that Ukraine is making first steps and transformation in governance. And again, given that you worked in many other countries, I was wondering what is the role model? What country is the role model for you? Where Ukraine should arrive in a number of years?
Oh wow, that's the $1 million question, isn't it, Adomis? No, I can't name one country, and I'll explain why. The first is that there's no single model of corporate governance, and I think all of us working on corporate governance issues know that the OECD principles and the OECD guidelines, they're based on the principle that these are outcomes-based instruments. So in other words, how you get there is going to be unique to both the legal and regulatory frameworks, the institutions that are in place, how robust is the rule of law, and how deep are the capital markets. What is your investor base in Ukraine? Are we talking, and how concentrated is ownership? Are we talking about investor base that are mainly based on institutional investors? Are we talking about private strategic investors, family-owned companies that may be going public, or the public sector, public corporations? And so I think that in the design of the capital markets, a lot of these sort of, and sort of Ukraine's desire for how the direction it wants to take its capital markets will be a key factor in determining what useful models, what countries could serve as useful models. But I'd say that given that the capital markets are so are really sort of at a very emerging state right now, I would look to some neighboring European economies that have smaller, less developed capital markets, and that have been working gradually towards creating not only the legal and institutional frameworks that are necessary, strengthening all those aspects, but that are also sort of moving in the direction of deepening those capital markets. So yeah, I'm sorry I can't give you sort of a direct answer on that, but I really think that everything is context-based.
It is context-based. I agree with you, and also worked in a number of countries with governance. What can I say? That from the optics perspective, Ukraine doesn't look bad because you have major state-owned companies with really strong supervisory boards, with independent, with majority being independent. This is not the case for many European countries. But as a role model, at least my role model would be Sweden and Norway. Those countries have the best, in my opinion, the best standards, and this is the reason why usually you have OECD working group on corporate governance and privatization, led by people from those countries. The last question for you, and it's a difficult one. I want to press you a bit. Changing governance in the country is a massively difficult question. If you would need to put priorities, what needs to be done? 3 steps. What would be those steps? 3 simple steps, if I can call them simple.
Yeah, I would probably expand the list to more than just 3. I think 2 of them deal with your code and the institutional frameworks. So if we can put those in one category. I think that if you want this code to have an impact, I think it needs to be implemented. So I think that, advocates like the Corporate Governance Academy will play an important role in getting awareness around the code, the importance around it, and also explaining the rationale and why this is important for companies, making the business case for it. There are major issues in terms of perceptions of corruption, perceptions of a lack of investor protection that are sort of critical problems in Ukraine in order to reach some of the objectives that the code is sort of promoting. So that's one aspect that I would advocate for, and monitoring how well companies are doing in terms of implementing the code. So that's one aspect. Another aspect is, and Taras mentioned this in the introduction, is strengthening the institutions behind corporate governance in Ukraine. So basically, what is the role of the regulator in all of this in terms of monitoring, in terms of supervision and in enforcement? Look, things are done in different ways across jurisdictions. You have laws and regulations, so serious sort of hard law, and then you have soft law like codes. And there's going to be a unique combination of this in Ukraine. But at the same time, I think the code will carry more power and weight if it's done in a comply or explain way. Of course, this is done differently across the board, but if it really needs to be then implemented by the companies, not only the listed companies, but ideally at least those groups of companies, and also the state-owned enterprise sector. But I leave that as a separate topic because there's also a more developed set of legislation that targets those companies and requirements for those companies. And I would say with key corporate governance issues, if we're going to focus really on like the nitty-gritty issues, one would be strengthening independent boards of directors, diversity in boards, and ensuring that boards are fit for purpose. This means clarifying in the legal frameworks what we mean by words as independent directors. I know there's no sort of requirements for this set out in the code, but I think that going forward, that will be a key aspect. Strengthening some of the rules around fiduciary duties of boards of directors, because I think this really is an area that's lacking. Transparency and disclosure in terms of enhancing what's available to market participants, because key part of of all of this is to, enhance access to capital. Investors want information. So information is
Yeah.
power. And I think that part of that is a key aspect. And obviously, according to internationally recognized standards, IFRS standards. Strengthening internal controls. So enhancing both the audit functions and compliance functions in companies, but also subjecting companies to external independent audit by reputable firms. And I would say finally, and this is a big issue, is protecting shareholder rights. So in a market where you have a high levels of concentration of ownership, this will be key, not only in terms of protection from related party transactions, but also insider dealing and other challenges that are particular, well, not necessarily unique to Ukraine, but maybe are highlighted as particular challenges.
Thank you, Sarah. Thank you, Sarah, for this, for a really not an easy answer. I mean, the question was difficult, but the answer was very good. Maxim, Ivaras, when he opened this event, he said that Taras Ivanishin, former head of UCJ, is the father of the Codex. But I know that you are second father of the Codex, because that was initiated by you and Taras, and both of you worked very hard on the Codex. I wonder, what was your personal motivation to work on it?
Hi, Adamas. Hello, everyone. I would say that there were a couple of reasons why we moved to this flow of preparation of a new corporate governance code. Some of them already were mentioned, but I think it is still really good to say it once more. Maybe the first one was because of old principles for corporate governance. The initial document, which was prepared by Commission and with support of IFC, was in 2004. Then 8 years later, in 2012, there was a second edition of this of those principles, but by 2018 they are fully outdated. The new recommendations from OECD and G20 arrived. The new recommendations on European level arrived. So it was a good point of time to start the full process of amending those principles. The second reason must be is EU association agreement. It was signed by Ukraine in 2014, and one of annexes in this EU association agreement is dedicated to corporate governance and company law framework at all in general, and this annex also mentions that Ukrainian corporate governance code should be brought in line with OECD principles. So this was some kind of legal obligation that Ukraine should complete and accomplish to make Ukrainian association agreement be fulfilled. The third one, I would say that in 2018 exactly, the parliament passed some amendments to securities law, to securities legislation, which introduced first time comply or explain principle into Ukrainian legislation, I would say, and this first time Ukrainian stakeholders somehow faced this principle in corporate governance. So we introduced the principle, but the benchmark against which comply or explain should be conducted was out of date. So that was the third reason. And maybe last but not least, in 2018, I was appointed as a commissioner to commission, and my duties is corporate governance. So it was like one of my first project I started as a commissioner in commission. So something like this.
Thank you, Maxim. Maxim, the document is ready. It's a document prepared by Ukraine Corporate Governance Academy together with experts and together with your commission, but it's national document. It's not a document that belongs to the people that prepared it. It's national, so the name is important. But what is more important is that this document is used, so that it's alive. And I wonder what is the plan for the Commission to make sure that this document is used by business in Ukraine, so that more and more companies start to comply with the code. What are the plans here?
I would say that we are in commission here. We are in two positions. We're a regulator for capital markets and for corporate governance in general. And we also are shareholders in CSD, in Central Securities Depository, where we have a stake over 25% owned by Ukraine as a state, and we're representatives of the state. So I would say that now we have some practical issues to implement this new corporate governance code in practical in CSD as a joint stock company. CSD is a public joint stock company, so corporate governance is very crucial for company to promote it to become well known, and etc. etc. So we are as one of key shareholders at CSD, working together with NBU and with management of CSD. We are going to implement code in practical life of CSD. This is one point, and the second one, I would say that being in second position as a regulator, we have an authority on oversight of corporate governance in country in whole, and so I would say that we are going to make it as practical as possible by implementing this comply or explain principle in annual reporting, which hopefully will be next year appropriately done, but not like this year due to COVID. So now we're working for a new annual reporting regulation, which should implement all major points of corporate governance in corporate governance report, and we're willing to make it practical for all joint stock companies to say how they comply with this code, or explain why they're not complying with this code.
If you need to say how many companies comply with the code right now in Ukraine, what the number would be?
I would say that if we would talk about current point of time, I will say that fingers on my hands will be enough to count all companies that are more or less complying with code. But I hope that in a couple of years there will be more. Officially, we now have something like 12 or maybe 15 public joint stock companies, but none of them are ready to comply with new code. So it's a tough tough work for us to promote it, and we hope that with assistance of UCGA, the assistance of IFC, especially under this memorandum that we will sign in nearest future, we will make it this task accomplished, and corporate governance code will be practical by our companies in Ukraine.
Thank you, Maxim. You said that you can count these companies on your fingers, on one hand or both hands. I could not hear that, but perhaps I wish you that you have more fingers, perhaps thousands. I know that it's a sacrifice for you. It's not convenient, but that would be a sacrifice for the country. Garf, a few questions for you. US8 right now launching a big project on corporate governance and privatization of state-owned companies. Can you tell us about this project? What are the objectives, and what do you expect from this project?
Okay, first, thank you very much for inviting myself and USA to this panel. We think it's an incredibly important topic, and thank you, of course, for your academy and the National Securities and Stock Market Commission to actually adopt the Corporate Governance Code of Ukraine. That's a massive achievement. I know it's been over 2 years of work. We had the marches when it actually passed, but and you wanted a different sort of celebration. It's a different reality now, so having a format like this is a great idea to have a good substantive discussion. I appreciate the initiative on this. The principles of good governance and accountability, fairness, transparency, and responsibility, those are all USAID's core principles of how we do development work. And all of this is embedded within the code. And so that means that the code creates a sense of governance that will support all of our priorities. It's not just economic growth. It's everything we do in health. It's everything we do in democracy. When we work in the health sector, we run into corporate governance issues and SOEs. When we support education, it happens there. So this is, and I'll get into that a little bit more when I talk about the project, but it's so important for USAID across everything we do as a foundation of our development objectives to have corporate responsibility, not just, as mentioned, not just in the SOE sector, but we are talking the SOE sector primarily at the moment. It impacts all of our work. When I think about corporate governance reform, there's a few things I do want to talk about. One is that corporate governance reform has already tangibly improved the performance of Ukrainian state-owned enterprises. We can name several, but it creates confidence in investors in newly privatized or reformed companies. So you're already creating greater confidence. These boards that are being created bring trust. Corporate governance reform, it's an IMF benchmark, and it improves investment environments and provides confidence to investors. So that's very important. It increases the expertise by developing the strategic partnerships. Takes with other nations, it requires expertise. So bringing on foreigners into these boards in a way that they feel confident is very important. Corporate governance reforms improves improves transparency, and that's where I have my center on this is the transparency and anti-corruption messages. Independent boards can create a protection of an enterprise from corruption. It minimizes potential conflicts of interest and has ethics embedded within it. Independent management ensures decisions are made in favor of growth, efficiency, transparency, and competition. So it's all part of the core package. And corporate governance reforms improves efficiency. You're making leaner and better prepared companies that can interact with foreign entities better. So you have transparent, efficient, accountable state-owned enterprises that foreign entities will want to work with. And so a couple years ago, when you reached out to us, I forget who reached out to who, to ask us, would we want to work with you to develop this code? Like 2 years ago was not a high mark in anti-corruption efforts in Ukraine. Actually, there was a lot of sort of, the NAPC was politicized and not going very well. NABU was under attack. A lot of the institutions not functioning well. So when you came to us and said, we want an anti-corruption component and expertise from the beginning into the code, it was like, yes, these are the champions we want to work with. And so when we started working together, you know, the Saatchi project that I manage, it's support for anti-corruption champion institutions. You know, we do a lot to, you know, work with journalism, work with civil society. This project, who are the institutions that are going to be champions to develop what's necessary to fight corruption? And that's why we're happy to partner with this. And moving forward, you know, we want to continue engaging with you to keep the anti-corruption message going. And so as, you know, the reducing corruption in Ukraine's 3,000 plus SOEs is critical. So right now, currently we have the state-owned enterprise rapid response activity. That was like a bridge because we wanted to get activities going immediately in a few specific areas. The new one coming up is, yes, the state-owned enterprise reform activity. And that's been in design for a couple of years. And I think it's important how we place this activity in USAID's sort of broader set of activities and goals. Typically, you'll have the health office will develop their health programs, economic growth programs, and the democracy programs. This is an anti-corruption program that focuses on state-owned enterprises and reform of state-owned enterprises, including better information about state-owned enterprises, getting more information on, you know, how many are there, what's the status of them, you know, providing information to the public on where are the SOEs, and, you know, how can we share information. Second is legal reform, getting the legal base of state-owned enterprises. And third is divestment and figuring out which ones need to continue and which ones maybe could be, their functions could be done in a different form. So the status of this project is that we've sent out requests for information, we've gathered information, and in the coming months, probably there will be a request for proposals, and we will put together we'll have a competition as the way we typically do, and there will be a partner that will be chosen that will be working for several years specifically on SOE reform. So we're here for the long term because it is the most important issue. When we sat down and said, how do we fight corruption? How do we reach our goals in anti-corruption? The consensus was it's reform of state-owned enterprise, because without that, you won't get to the anti-corruption and then onward prosperity and accountability and the transformative goals that we want for this country. So this code is critical, and we're glad that our project will start with this as a good base.
Thank you. We started discussing about consultants because they will be working on this project. And what's interesting that this codex might be bad news for them. I'm working with quite a few state-owned enterprises, and I know that consultants, they come and they prepare corporate governance codes for that particular company, which does not make any sense because you can prepare one and share with everyone. So this document will kill some business and possibly will save you some money. So that's positive. Can you tell us how can UCJ community participate in the project you just discussed? Because we have many people interested in the topic, having relevant experience and willing to participate in this privatization and corporate governance reform project.
Right. Well, right now it's a bit of wait and see. You know, you can see that the different organizations, because one large company will get the project and then they'll bring on lots and lots of partners. So at the moment, requests for more information. People are starting to gather their teams to create the proposals to USAID. So part of it is if you're in there now, you can be part of the team early. The best way is once there is a partner chosen, an implementing partner chosen, then you just want to reach out to them and find out how they start to implement their ideas. If it's through grants, if it's through seminars, it's bringing people together. And that's when you can really become part of it once the project is up and running. And that's still a ways out. So that's many months out.
Thank you. Thank you everyone for connecting. I know that the format is non-traditional, but it already became usual during the last 4 months, and I believe that in the future it will be even more usual, so we have to use to it. And right now we have a second panel with private Ukrainian businesses, will be moderated by Aivaras Abramovičius, and they will be discussing about corporate governance state in Ukraine in private companies, and why private companies do invest in governance and why sometimes they don't invest in governance. So thank you very much, and I invite you for the second panel.